Okay, so welcome everybody. We have Professor Steve McKay with us this evening, or today, to cover the interview protocols, interviews and focus group webinar, and then we'll be then going across onto questions and answers, and then onto the Professor is in, which again, Professor McKay will be joining us. Over to you, Professor McKay.
Okay, Jack, thanks very much. Hopefully everyone can see the screen, so we're all okay in that sense. Okay, right. Well, what I want to do is just to sort of give a very quick overview of why I really sort of passionately believe in interviewing or interview and talking to people, which of course is what interviews are about. And then, of course, that's not to say that you can't use a survey approach in the interviews, but that always strikes me as being a bit of a, I wouldn't say a waste opportunity. But if you're going to use surveys, then best to send them out in advance and then use the sort of the face-to-face opportunity to explore some of the sort of responses. So it can be a two-pronged approach, but we'll come back to some of the issues. What I particularly like about this approach, and again, it obviously depends upon what it is that we're trying to discover. I come from a tradition, my background was actually engineering. Now, of course, you don't conduct interviews with inanimate objects for obvious reasons, because of course, they can't give you responses. You can measure certain things. So it comes back down to, or it comes ultimately to what it is that you're trying to discover. And insofar as that, if the sort of the nature of the phenomenon that you're interested in is subjective, which of course is necessarily sort of the views of people's experiences perhaps, then an interview is a very good way, if you like, of eliciting those opinions. Of course, the real difficulty that you have, and of course that there's sort of the challenge that's made, is that how do you then codify the responses, and that has its own sort of difficulties, but I'll again come back to that. So what I would like to say is that as somebody who likes to speak to other people, and given that human beings are nothing if not dialogical creatures, interviews provide a really good opportunity to get in and talk to people, and then to find out and to explore the nature of what it is that you're interested in. Now, of course, I'm talking ultimately in very abstract terms, and what I would always advise is to sort of to think carefully about the nature of what you're trying to sort of to understand, and the best way to sort of to get to the heart of what it is that you think will sort of provide deeper understanding, and more particularly the research data, which of course is so essential to any piece of sort of work. So without further ado, I mean, you probably have all seen this, so we're going to sort of look through all the sort of the aspects of interviews and focus groups. And there obviously is a difference, or in fact, I'll also point this out. I think an interview is best done on a one-to-one basis, although it doesn't have to be. But then you get into what you might regard as small focus groups. But focus groups tend to be sort of much larger groups of individuals where you're trying to get a spectrum of opinion. Most particularly, it's about understanding sort of the way in which you can understand day-to-day practice. And of course, I make that, or at least I stress the sort of the importance of the word practice, because practice is what people do. And then there is this theory and practice conundrum, if you like, or sort of the distinction that theory is what we think goes on, practice is what people do. And quite often the sort of nature of the research endeavor is to sort of either reconcile or to sort of to appreciate why the sort of the explanation provided by external people such as academics doesn't match up to sort of the reality. Thinking about questions, because questions are, there is something which I came across many years ago, which is the sort of the idea that if you ask a question, you necessarily know the sort of the nature of the response. And what I like also about sort of interviews is that if you do it in the way which I'm suggesting, is it does allow you plenty of flexibility to go beyond the questions, or at least to ask questions in such a way as it opens up other avenues of discussion. And more particularly, it gets you to think about things, or at least it gives the participants the opportunity to sort of to raise issues that you may never have even thought about. And this is why I think it provides such a good differentiation, if you like, or is so different to using a survey where you've asked preconceived questions, of which there will be particular answers, and so on and so forth. If I say when we've use questionnaires at the university I'm part of. What was always interesting is to sort of box any other sort of views, and of course that's when people get their opportunity to sort of provide what they really think. And of course that's all well and good if people sort of have the time and inclination to sort of do it, because of course questionnaires tend to be sort of done quickly, and of course particularly in the electronic format that tend to come in, people like to sort of tick the box or to circle the sort of the answer, because of course it's a very much a sort of fire and forget mechanism. So what I would sort of say is that you do have to sort of think carefully about the way you do interviews and the sort of the time that will be required to sort of to prepare them, and also to sort of to operationalize them. Okay, so we're going to sort of look at the sort of the protocols and some ethical considerations, because of course you can't just walk into organizations and interview people. They have problems. And then we'll look at focus groups and their protocols and ethical consideration, because although they're not dissimilar. Potential resistance, that I would actually say that the resistance comes if people don't want to sort of participate. Normally, my experience has been, without exception, but that there are always exceptions to the exceptions, as it were, that if people want to sort of talk or are willing to talk, sometimes the difficulty is keeping it under control, because people do like to sort of to expand upon their areas. But again, we'll talk about it. Importance of recording data, the interpretation, analysis, and then of course the presentation and dissemination, which of course is the sort of the payoff from your perspective. Okay, right. Again, I think we've probably sort of done this in the last slide, but I'll quickly go through this. So looking at practice and sort of providing evidence to sort of particular problems or issues. And of course, the whole point about doing this is that the people that you want to speak to, the individuals, whoever they may be, they have understanding, they have knowledge, experience, whatever it may be. They've got something useful to say, which is germane to sort of the topic that you're interested in, as opposed to questionnaires, which of course tends to be sort of much more, well, I'm making a sweeping assertion here, so I can provide a health warning, where of course you can send this to people who may not have the intimate knowledge, but they might be able to, or might be willing to provide more speculative opinions. But again, nothing is ruled in or out at the sort of this stage. You do what works. The most important thing, bullet point number 2, it's about the in-depth exploration, and normally sort of one-to-one sort of basis, or up to 10 for a focus group. And again, there are exceptions, so you can have more than sort of one, so it becomes plural for an interview. Whether you would have more than 10 for a focus group is debatable. It's not impossible, but certainly if somebody said, I'm going to have a focus group of 100 people, yeah, that's not a focus group, that's an audience, and it becomes a sort of, you may interact, but it's not the same. What you want is a sort of a group of people that you can ideally make eye contact with, and you can communicate, and they can communicate with you, and they can communicate with each other. And 10 is usually regarded as a sort of probably the sort of the upper limit. Beyond that, there are all sorts of difficulties. And then you end up with subgroups and factions, perhaps sometimes, which is not impossible. So that's another thing you've got to watch out for. Okay, so you're exploring what goes on and why, what they believe that they've seen and experienced, and to make sense. And of course, that's the other thing. It's about sort of the interaction with people's understanding of what they believe is going on. There is an issue which I'll sort of just highlight at this point. What they tell you is what they believe has gone on. It's not for you to sort of to proffer judgment, although in your conclusions you may wish to sort of to provide some sort of analysis of why people have told you certain things. But of course, the thing about sort of opinions is that people hold them dearly, and whatever their opinions are are their opinions. And if they've come to sort of certain conclusions, then it's up to you as the researcher to sort of to examine why that they believe what they believe. And there are all sorts of issues and perhaps some ethics that might be attached to that. So, okay, so as is suggested, interviews and focus groups tend to be inductive by nature. What I mean by that is that you're normally going in to examine, because if you're trying to sort of to test things, then I would suggest that sort of interviews and focus groups are not sort of the best way to do it, albeit that it's not impossible to use that as a sort of way to sort of go in and test opinions, perhaps. but I would sort of say that if you're going to do that, then a survey mechanism might be sort of more fruitful. And as I indicated a couple of moments ago, using the survey instrument combined with some interviews is not a bad way to sort of to develop deeper understanding. Okay, as should be sort of apparent from everything I've said so far, you're looking for sort of the accounts that people provide, and it's about sort of intense effort on recording the data, because of course what you can then do is to sort of to use these accounts, whatever people have told you, as faithful sort of representations of what people believe, and you can then present that, not whole, I would accept, because of course interview data does tend to be sort of it's a time-consuming process, but also more particularly it generates an awful lot of words. So you've then got to sort of use your selective nous and your judicial judgment based upon your sort of expertise as a researcher as to you think what are the most important aspects, the sort of, as my supervisor many years used to sort of call them, the nuggets, the sort of things that really sort of shine out and tell you things which are particular and really help to demonstrate the sort of the nature of what it is that you're interested in. Okay, right, okay, again, this almost feels like I'm repeating myself, but to explain, understand and explore those with particular knowledge, which of course is important. As I said in bullet point 2 here, the closed questions may be used. I would suggest that sort of closed questions tend to be sort of used in sort of a questionnaire. Now, of course, what I would say is that it's not to say that you could have a questionnaire which you use in the interview, and that's not impossible. But I would have said that's probably a little bit of a waste of valuable time. Better to sort of send that in advance and get the person to complete it in advance, and then you can perhaps use that as the sort of the way to open up the discussion. So what I would sort of say is that sort of interview questions, even though that they may be intended to elicit particular responses, which could be closed, or sort of they could be to provide deeper description. It's about open-ended objectives, or with the objective of being open-ended to provide this in-depth exploration. So the more that you can get people to open up, the better it is, because of course, dare I say, it's almost a cathartic experience, and people can provide what they believe to be sort of really sort of intimate sort of knowledge about the sort of the nature of what it is that you're interested in, and that will allow you as the researcher to provide a better and more faithful account of actual practice, i.e. what goes on and why. And again, you know, just to emphasize this, I know the question will probably come up, what if people sort of don't want to be recorded? And the reality then is that you've got a sort of a big difficulty, because the challenge is if you're going to record people's views, you've got to do it accurately. But anyone who's ever done this will sort of tell you, and I'm constantly aware that I have my own verbal tics, and I'm happy for people to point them out to me. People don't talk in the way that they write, because of course what we do when we write is we edit and we tidy up, as it were. That's what. So insofar as that, when you're sort of or if you're going to present accounts, even though I've seen people do this, that they write in shorthand, it's never, well, it's rarely, if ever, entirely sort of 100% accurate, because it doesn't include all the sort of the verbal tics and whatever, which, yeah, I appreciate can be sort of taken out because they don't add anything to it. But the difficulty you've also got is that if you take notes at the same time as you're speaking to people, then you lose something. So that the point about tape recording is that you can then concentrate on sort of the one-to-one verbal contact between yourself and the sort of the interviewees, plural, if that's the case. And you can then, as I say, make that sort of visual contact, and it is often about the whole body thing. So if you're busily writing, it is quite difficult to do two things at the same time. And also what it does allow you to do is to sort of pick up on things which perhaps you may miss otherwise, a really important point which might have got lost in the sort of the verbal description that you can sort of pick up upon. And the thing about tape recording also is it does allow you to sort of go back and listen. So you've got a sort of an account that will provide you with the sort of the that not just recollection, that sort of, you know, as it happened, a contemporaneous account, which you can then sort of examine and think about more carefully when you go back to wherever it is that you carry out your research or do your writing, and really sort of start to reflect and explore. Okay, so interviews are important insofar as getting, as I keep stressing, the opinions, the views, and the nature of understanding that people have, or appreciation of people have with respect to a phenomenon or aspects of that phenomenon or concepts or whatever word you care to use, which have relevance to the piece of work that you're carrying out research in. So who do you talk to? Well, that is obviously the big question, but quite clearly you talk to anybody who that you believe has got something useful to say. So quite clearly, once you've identified people who have a particular interest. Now, for example, just to use people I spoke to, I was doing quality management. This is back in the 1990s. And I was doing it in a particular sector. So what I then did, and because it was fairly novel at that time, I just identified a number of organizations and I made cold contact, which actually is not the most effective way of doing it. Better if you can get to talk to people with connections. And indeed, that actually happened subsequently. It was possible to use focus groups and or at least interest groups that have been set up. But what you're trying to do quite clearly is to get to the people who you believe possess the best basis of the information that you will need in order to provide this data that will be so important to substantiate the work that you're going to produce, whether it be published in journals or books or chapters, or more particularly in the thesis that you're going to write. Okay, so it's a survey instrument and it's exploratory and descriptive. And again, it will range then when you talk to these people from the completely unstructured, in which the person is allowed to talk freely, to it can be highly structured. So again, I'm not. What I would stress once again is that you've got to do what you think works best. And if you think a highly structured way of doing this is important, then that's perfectly fine. The important thing I would also stress is that when you talk to people, what you're trying to do is to talk to them about the same things. And so a schedule of questions, whatever you do, even if there are a number of open-ended questions, because what you'd be expected to do is to demonstrate the questions that you asked, and you would be expected to ask consistent questions to all of the people that you interviewed. So be aware of that particular one, and certainly when it comes to Viva, just actually to add something, that you don't necessarily have to provide all the interview transcripts, because of course that's the whole package of data. It's a bit like you wouldn't be expected to provide all the surveys you sent out if you were using that particular approach, but nonetheless you'd be expected to demonstrate the nature of the questions, why you asked the people the questions you asked them, and who you spoke to and why, and so on and so forth. So you've got to justify the actions. So the important thing is to be systematic and rigorous as much as is possible, but also, as I'll increasingly stress, use the ability to think on your feet and be flexible, and to see opportunities when they present themselves. Okay. I think this is, again, it's restating everything I've talked about already. Opinions, because opinions are based upon what people think is going on. Experiences, perceptions, attitudes, specific knowledge, expertise, i.e. anything that you think that this person has got to add with respect to the things that you're talking about. Now, quite clearly, when we've all seen programs where people are interviewed by the police, quite clearly the police don't just interview anybody. They want to talk to people who actually have got something useful to do. And obviously in formal interviews, it's because they believe that they were involved. But quite clearly what you would not expect to happen is to get into the interview situation and people say, well, I don't know anything. In that sense, if that were to occur, then something has gone incredibly wrong, because quite clearly the whole point about approaching the person in the first instance is that they have any one of these, and it can be a whole range of things that they can contribute, positive or useful, or in fact, let me say they can even present negative views, because they may hate what's going on, but of course that's their opinion. And in fact, as I will sort of stress subsequently, what you want is a good spectrum of opinions, because when something is introduced, and again, to use my sort of aspect of quality management, I appreciated that the people I was talking to, primarily those people who were given responsibility for its oversight and implementation and development and all such things, they obviously had a vested interest, but not all the people that they were trying to get involved saw it the same way. So that was also useful. So in terms of sort of exploring the sort of the resistance that they had to deal with and how that they coped. So as I say, when you talk to people, they will tell you what they believe to be true, and you faithfully record it, and then you make sense of it later. And again, we're going to come to talk about the sort of the number of people involved in interviews, but I'll leave that one open. I think that the more interviews you can do, the better. But do remember, you know, there are time and logistics involved in this, and it also depends upon sort of the nature of the sort of the research. Yes, if you're doing a longitudinal piece of work, then you normally sort of you may do a number of interviews with the same people over and over again, which was my approach, as opposed to sort of one-off interviews with people who you interview once and then move on. Okay, the first stages. So again, you can probably see that it's kind of re-emphasizing everything I've said. Who do you believe can offer useful informational views? Most importantly, and never let's underestimate this, who the people or will these people want to be involved? And quite clearly, if you're doing something really sensitive, that has particular issues attached to it, and confidentiality, they may not be allowed to talk to you. And indeed, you know, the fact is, though, just because that there are a number of people you think that can provide really useful sort of views on your research, there's nothing that sort of gives you any sort of right to ask. Well, you have a right to ask them, but you have no right to expect that they should sort of acquiesce. I would sort of say that in my experience, if you make this approach correctly, and you do it through a formalistic sort of way, and it can be shown what the sort of the nature of the research is, then normally most people are quite happy, albeit that they may add certain caveats. And of course, this is where we get into the issue of that there may be certain things which are sort of off limits that, you know, they're not allowed to talk to or do not wish to talk to you about. And indeed, they may have certain difficulties with tape recording, and indeed they may wish to sort of to look at what it is that you're going to publish, and to have some sort of view over that or oversight, and to sort of to the right to sort of to edit. And so these are all points which of course will be sort of sorted out at the beginning. So this will be to do with the sort of protocols. And I mention ethics now because I don't want to get too embroiled in ethics, because of course that's a separate aspect, but of course everything we do has ethical considerations. And normally when you sort of do this, your university will have a view, also will it have a committee, and you will be expected to present a summary of what it is that you wish to do and the question you're going to ask, and all of the sort of issues about sort of consent, which is of course the most important thing, that people consent to being interviewed and they agree that sort of their opinions are going to be used in research. This will all be covered off, as it were, because of course the last thing you want to do is to sort of go out and do a whole lot of interviews and then find out that people suddenly decide that, oh, I don't think I really should have done this, because of course that leaves you a bit high and dry. So you want to make sure that the people have agreed to this. Now, of course, I appreciate, even then, of course, that if something happens, and I'm not going to sort of give you a particular example, and something in their company that perhaps they're under investigation, and they can no longer sort of, or they no longer wish for their views to sort of to be published, then yeah, it would be really sort of bad form and destroy relationships if you then went ahead and published even though they consented. The point I would wish to make is that sort of the more you can think about the issues in advance, the better. By covering off the sort of the list of eventualities and thinking sort of almost the unthinkable, then you will sort of have contingencies and plans. The most important thing I think to sort of to emphasize is the more that you're open and upfront to people in the sort of the first instance, the better, because of course people then who are sort of fully aware of what's going on they won't find difficulties otherwise, but they certainly will do if they feel that you've not been more than honest with them in the sort of first instance. Okay, having sort of identified these people and gone through all the sort of the ethical considerations, you then got to make contact. So again, phone book perhaps, if people use such things. Obviously, the internet. It really depends. Quite clearly, that the context of the situation in which these people sort of do whatever they do with respect to the phenomenon that you're interested in, that will provide the link. What I would say is, if you've got personal links, someone who can sort of open doors for you or make connections, that's really sort of effective. That's really, really helpful in terms of being able to sort of to make that first connection. Because of course, as we sort of all know, and we've all experienced cold calling where somebody just rings you up out of the blue, it can be difficult. Sending letters, which is might be useful. Depends upon what the sort of the nature of sort of your endeavour is. And as I say, the more you can be upfront and honest about what it is that you want to achieve, the better. Once you've selected interviews, contact, well, once you've selected them, request the participation. So this is the point at which you sort of spell out what it is that you're going to do and how you're going to do it, and sort of allay any fears through sort of agreement and consent and whatever else. And at this point, hopefully, provided that they're willing, you can actually sort of deal with any sort of concerns that they may have. Right, okay, I mean, this last bullet point here, if you receive refusal, don't be discouraged. The worst actually is that sometimes you sort of you try and contact people, and it has happened to me on a couple of occasions where you just hear nothing, and you may follow up a couple of times, and then eventually you give up because of course there's nothing you can do. The point is, though, persevere, try with other people, because there will always be a range of people who are willing to be involved, and that is the nature of research, and people accept that sort of being involved in research projects is a sort of a really good way of helping to sort of the world to better understand what we do and how we do it. Okay, what I did is I sort of set a number of questions, and of course one of the which is, how many people should you interview? And the reality is that there's no precise number. But having said that, if you're doing a PhD, for example, and you interviewed 2 people, it feels a bit thin. Now, if somebody says I interviewed 100 people, well, that's an altogether different matter. This is a question of judgment, and again, I can only talk in generalities on this one, but obviously the more you can do it, the better. Remember, I think, well, I do actually use the word there, the issue of representativeness. It's a bit like if you're doing a survey and the population is potentially 1 million people, yeah, for sure, you can send the interview, the survey, the questionnaire, to use a better word, to all 1 million people. That's not impossible using the internet. But the reality is that you're not going to get the sort of the response rate. You're going to get a sort of a fraction. And normally what we do is you select a sample, and it's exactly the same sort of thing when we're sort of carrying out interviews. You want a representative sample, or a purposeful sample, as I think it's sometimes called, of which you have a selection of people or a number of people who can adequately contribute to what it is that you're interested in. So, but I also said, think about logistics and time, excuse me, because if you're going to do 100 interviews, and okay, the internet and dare I say it, the last couple of years has made interviewing easier in many ways, because of course you can set up to do it via Skype or Zoom or some other sort of proprietary package, which allows you to to interview someone from your wherever you carry out your sort of research, and to anybody literally in the world. Certainly when I was doing it, what was required is to go and meet these people, which is normally the expected method of doing this. So you have to arrange to travel there, set up the interview, do the interview, come back. And I would say, even if you do an hour's interview and it takes you an hour to get them back, that's half a day. And quite often, in my experience, I used to find you could spend a whole day. So the point is, though, it's up to you to dedicate your time in the best way that you see fit. But remember that you've got to carry out the interviews, and then you've got to transcribe them, and that can also be a pretty onerous process. So you've got to fit it in with logistics. The important thing is that as long as you've shown to whoever it is that's going to be reviewing this work, whether it be referees or external examiners or internal examiners, rather, the examiners for a PhD, that you've chosen a representative sample and you've got a good body of opinion, then that's all that they would expect. You know, and more than that, and of course, I know that there's no definitive line on this one, then you're not expected to sort of go way beyond the sort of the reasonable sort of representativeness, if I can sort of put a number of sort of words into the same sentence. Okay, I mentioned this already. Any reason which mean the person you'd only like to will be bound by confidentiality and require clearance. Yeah, well, the point is that if that's the case, that then it may be that they can't, or they're not willing to do the interview, which is fine. Then you know that there's no point in sort of trying to push on that one because it's going to go nowhere. But it may be that they can be interviewed about certain aspects, but certain other aspects of whatever their role are, and because this may be, as I say, involve sensitive material, or aspects of the sort of research which are controversial, whatever that may mean, then you know that becomes a sort of a red line that you're not allowed to sort of to ask them about that, and you know they then may sort of say, well, no, I can't talk about it. Anyway, the point is though, at the outset you'll have sort of sort all of that out. Will the interviews need to consider sort of the questions in advance? Yeah, well, I think if they wish to do that, that is no bad thing, and that's why I think if you combine it with another survey instrument where you've got sort of a number of questions containing a questionnaire, that can be the sort of the starting point. But it may be that you get them, or you send them sort of questions that you like to think about, and then you're going to sort of to discuss them in more detail when you do the face-to-face thing, and that's perfectly fine. So that's not an issue. And clearly, the more helpful that you can be to helping them, the more likely it is that they're going to sort of give you what you want. Do interviews need to see your answer, so see the answers that you provide, or say the answers that they provided to you and that you transcribe? Well, yes, of course, that there's no reason why they shouldn't do. Nothing is secret in this process. Can the interviews ask for anonymity? And the answer to that one is, of course, yes, they can do. And indeed, what I did in the sort of the piece of work I did for my own piece of, my own PhD, there were 12 participants who I interviewed on umpteen occasions. So it was a longitudinal piece of work over a couple of years. I gave them all pseudonyms, so I knew who they were. And indeed, I gave what you might call sort of thumbnails for descriptions of what their jobs were and who they worked for. Yeah, I suspect that some might have been able to work out who they were, but yeah, you'd have to be sort of pretty clever to sort of do that. And the whole point about anonymity is that sort of they can't be identified by others, and there may be good reasons why that's the case. And again, I'm not going to sort of go into that in detail, but if that's the sort of the nature of getting access, then that's perfectly fine in my opinion. And it's something which, of course, if you explain in your methodology to those people who sort of carry out the review or the examination thereof, then they will understand the reasons for so doing. Right, okay, I put this one in because it's a really horny sort of chestnut, as we say in the UK. Can you assume that interviews will tell the truth? And my answer to that one is that sort of why would they not do that? And of course, the sort of the fact is that how would you know? So what you've got to assume is that sort of that they are doing this, and it is indeed a faithful account, and that as I say, you record what they do, sorry, what they tell you, in the way that they present it. It's a really difficult one. But of course, does the fact that somebody fills in a questionnaire does that mean to say that they've provided honest answers? Yeah, certainly, I'm going to admit that when I fill in questionnaires, I do them with not the greatest amount of thought about what the sort of the answers are. So in an interview situation, you hope that sort of people are thinking deeply about the questions and they're providing you with answers which they believe to sort of to truly represent their opinions. But again, as I say, that this is not sort of like a police interview where you do it with the sort of all the normal caveats that they use about sort of truthfulness and sort of being tested in court and all that sort of thing. That's not the sort of the nature of this particular process. Knowing your audience is important. The more you know about these people in advance, the better. If you can sort of get to understand who they are and what their backgrounds are, it'll make your job much easier, in my opinion. So I would suggest then that a bit of sort of prior research. Once you've actually identified people, then it's obviously important then to do a bit of searching around, because of course it shows that you've shown interest in them. And therefore, of course, it's possible to make that report, because of course that's the whole point. What makes the process work effectively is a rapport, which of course is the idea that you get to know them. And certainly, and I appreciate it's very difficult if you do a one-off interview, then it's not so important as well. It's important, but much more important if you can interview these people on umpteen subsequent occasions, because of course the more you get to know them, the more they're like to open up and tell you the things that you really want to know. So it's a bit like relationships, that they take time to develop. And obviously, of course, people they only allow you, to see so much. Whereas, of course, as we know with families, we know them warts and all. So the more the personal relationships develop, the better. But of course, obviously, they have to. Everyone recognises that the nature of what they're doing is it's a research process, and so what they're telling you will be used for research purposes. Okay, the important thing also is that remember that all interviews, or not all interviews, are conversant with academic language or buzzwords. So when you ask your questions, do it in a way which you think is going to elicit the responses that you want them to give you. So asking questions, which I'll come back to, in a way which opens up their opinions is an important part of this process. Because again, I also stress to students that academic journals, they're written in a way which is for other academics, but that's not necessarily the way that people talk to others. So that crossover is quite important if you're going into the world of practitioners who maybe think about things in a very different way. It's not a big impediment, I appreciate, but it's something to be aware about. But also all the time, think about the answers that you wish them to present, what's going to be useful for the research that you wish to present. And indeed, of course, the other thing is that develop as many questions you believe you'll need and prioritize. The point I would say is that if you've got an hour's interview and you've got 100 questions, well, there are only 60 minutes. You can barely ask a question in 10, 15 seconds. So the more questions you put in, the less time that people have got to give answers. So again, I know it may sound relatively straightforward, but if that's the nature of what you're doing, then of course there's a lot of superficial stuff. And I would just say in this situation, more is definitely less. Or what I mean by that is to ask a few target questions, allow people to open up, because that's the nature of what you've got. The important point also is that you may think that you've got hours to do this, but people in organizations are often very busy, and that their willingness to give you time, it may be extremely limited, and an hour may be as much as you get. It depends, whereas focus groups tend to be longer periods of time. Okay, remember the best question, purposely provide the interview with the opportunity to open up. And I think that's absolutely essential. The more people do that, the better, because of course they're providing you with this intimate knowledge, this rich data that you would not have otherwise been able to elicit through the likes of questionnaires, or merely observing. This is your opportunity to probe deeply and to go far and wide. In terms of protocols, it's making the people feel at ease. So normally you may wish to do that at their offices perhaps, or somewhere that they feel comfortable with. And also I said there, this may provide additional information, so which of course you can describe subsequently if you think that is a useful aspect and provides better knowledge of what's going on and why. Quite clearly, you have to fit in with their timings. It's not to suit you; you've got to suit them. Absolutely, fundamentally. And if you can't fit in with them, then you're going to damn yourself. So be willing to offer lots and lots of flexibility. And also, the other thing I would say to you is be constantly aware that people in business and organisations, that they have a habit of things come up, life and events happen, and they have to sort of change arrangements. Often there's a very last minute. I know it's annoying, but at the same sort of time that you just have to go with it. If that person is somebody you need to speak to or would like to speak to, then sort of do so. Also fit in with whatever that they need. And quite often it may be that you have to do it sort of after work, when they've got sort of time. I have to say, when I came out my research, I was willing to sort of meet people in more social situations, not necessarily over a drink because that's more difficult, but over a meal, if that was or in a sort of a restaurant or a service station, which is the place I was thinking about. There were difficulty with the sort of the acoustics, but of course it fitted in with their schedule because otherwise they weren't working. This was we could meet somewhere on the motorway system. Okay, sense already, scene setting, developing rapport, and of course the other thing is though, assuming you've got agreement to use the recording device, don't forget to turn it on, because of course that's something which I've done on a couple of occasions. You get so carried away by meeting them and talking about the issues, you don't then record it, which is a really great missed opportunity. Okay, when you actually get to sort of doing the interview, introduce yourself, explain the purpose. Ensure you've got questions that will provide the best possible explanations, but as I've said, also by asking open questions in a way which allows people to sort of to open up is really good, and it allows them to sort of provide alternative explanations. Ask questions in a sequence. Now, only you will know which sequence that is, but normally from the sort of the general or to commence, the sort of the way to open up, and I'll talk about this later when we talk about focus groups, that those may be sort of appropriate to this situation. So bear that in mind when I talk about this in a couple of moments. But think about what it is that you're trying to do. So from the broad to the specific, and think about themes. So, but again, obviously, so much depends upon the nature of the sort of the subject that you're wishing to research. Be flexible and possibly also sequence if you think it works better in the sort of particular situation you're in. And some people may, they may wish to sort of to talk about things differently. Yeah, that's fine. What works for them is what works for them. So be willing to sort of go along with it. What I would also say is to test questions in advance. The whole point about this is that you're never going to get perfect questions first time round. In fact, is there any such thing as a perfect question? And quite often what I found is that sort of your questions develop with experience. So experience is the sort of the key to success, and the more you do it, the better you become. I put this in, avoid leading questions, but sometimes leading questions are useful to get people to open up. But yeah, I mean, what I do say later on is that just because people don't sort of tell you what you think you need to know or want to know, or it aligns with your sort of preconceived ideas, and particularly if they're saying things that you don't necessarily agree with, then that's fine. Their opinions are their opinions, and that's the whole point about talking to a range of people, to get that spectrum of views. Okay, keep the conversation moving. Well, I've talked about here, I've talked about closed question, talked about open question, I've talked about explorative, which of course tend to be sort of the precursor to open questions. But so you want to use questions in such a way as that they keep people sort of thinking about the sort of the issues. There is a sort of view that if people sort of go silent, that shows that they think about it, but of course it can be a bit awkward. And of course, if they go silent for too long, then it becomes difficult. But nonetheless, if they think about things, that's perfectly fine. Stay on topic, but be willing to entertain new themes, because of course this may sort of raise issues that you've not previously contemplated. Don't worry about silence, as I've mentioned. Yeah, and if something comes up and it is related to the research, be willing to ask follow-up or additional questions. So this is where you've got to be a bit fleet of foot. You've got to maybe think on your feet, because particularly if it's something you hadn't thought about previously, this may be some a really rich vein of data. But of course, as I say, it doesn't necessarily align with what you thought you were going to find, having looked at the literature, because of course literature is the sort of the starting point for any piece of research, what exists out there. But of course, what this may allow you to do is to sort of provide different perspectives, which of course is new knowledge, and that's really, really sort of valuable. Be aware of time. And of course, as I say, that if you've got an hour, you know, don't spend the first 10 minutes talking about, you know, I don't know, the weather or football or whatever it might be, even though that's part of the process of rapport. You've got to use the sort of the time valuably, because these people often have to sort of move on. In fact, I find that with sort of Skype conversations, people sort of they disappear, you know, on the sort of the dot, because of course they have another Skype conversation coming in. But you know, people are busy, and you can't abuse that relationship. Okay. When we get to sort of interview data, I'm going to sort of talk about this in general terms, because there's no easy way to deal with this. That you remember, transcribed data, it takes up a lot of space, and what I found is a sort of a kind of a general rule. A 1 hour interview used to take probably the best part of a day to transcribe. So it depends how long your day is, but you know, 6 to 8 hours doing nothing but just sort of transcribing. There is software that helps with this process, but you still have to go back and check. But of course, the point then is that sort of if you get reams and reams of interview data, you can't just stick it in verbatim, because of course, even though that's the full account, you've got to then select out the sort of the parts of it that sort of are really and absolutely sort of germane to what it is that you're interested in. So you've got to think about what the sort of the data, or how the data will relate to sort of the themes or the conceptual framework that you've already developed. And then, of course, what it may allow you to do, particularly if you've got new aspects, is to talk about different things and to provide a sort of or present an alternative set of concepts, things that sort of come out of this work that you did, or this research through interviews, that allowed you to sort of get the different understanding of what the sort of the reality of the issues are. But okay, so the point is, though, remember that yeah, it's a long and time-consuming process. People don't speak clearly in the way that we would like to. You know, let's face it, you know, public speaking is a really great skill, something which I've found difficulty in doing. Some people say that they provide very useful and long accounts, but of what they do and how they do it. But remember, as I say, you've got to sort of just record it in the way that they do. Again, when I was it was always used to fascinate me. I quite like putting in sort of the slang words and bad language, because it showed authenticity. It's a faithful account. That was the way that the people spoke to me. But some people may have some issues about that. Okay, the most important thing, and you know, this is the crux of the key task, is to use the parts of the transcript which provides, or say, which explains what's going on and why from the perspective of the interviewee. Yeah, no more, no less. And that's all you're trying to do, is to provide a sort of a range of opinions that gives you this fulsome scripted explanation of everything that's going on and why. And again, I talked about this a couple of moments ago. The starting point of research is existing theory. So therefore, of course, that will sort of raise the questions that you wish to ask at the starting point. But then you may provide different sort of explanations which emerges from the data, which is really useful in presenting those opinions. Okay, and you know, again, you know, I'm going to, I was going to say, I'm really conscious of time, but word limits, remember that sort of transcribed data, it does tend to provide a lot of words. So you know, maybe hundreds of thousands of words, so you can't include everything. So you've got to be aware that if you put transcribed data in, it takes away from sort of your ability to use those words, you know, whether it be a thesis or a research publication. So you've got to be careful. Use it sort of as economically as you can, and by that I mean to use as little as you think you can get away with. I don't mean that in a cynical way, but enough to sort of explain what it is that you're sort of interested in, because of course long excerpts of interview data will sort of reduce the sort of the words that you've got available. Okay. Couple of things. It's about emphasizing practice. Things that people find mundane in practice are often sort of really fascinating to us as outsiders. And so, of course, that's the whole sort of thing about sort of being the insider, the outsider, and that's a really useful aspect of sort of what interviews allow us to do. And also, I think it allows those in practice to sort of think about their own issues and to sort of to reflect. And reflection is a good thing for all concerned. Providing a spectrum of opinion of the sort of the interviews that you've carried out. So the more people you interview, the better, but within the sort of limits I talked about earlier on. And obviously what you've got to do is suspend judgment and any preconceived beliefs, and learning to make the connection between theory and practice and vice versa. So you've come from theory and you're interested in practice, what goes on, but that then allows you to present a different alternative, which and one would hope better view of what practice consists of, which is provides better theory, strangely enough. Oops, I think I've gone backwards. I'm into the focus group, so we're into the last 5 minutes or so. A focus group is essentially it's like an interview, but on a bigger scale. And again, I'm not trying to be flippant. What you're doing here is to get a number of individuals together in the same forum. And whereas I think interviews tend to be shorter period, over a shorter duration, hour and a half maybe, what you'd normally do with a focus group is that you'd interview these, you bring together these people, probably over a half day. And the idea is that it's about you asking questions, if you like, if I analogize about dropping a pebble into the pond and the ripples, they go outwards. So the focus group is about you dropping the pebbles through the questions, and then that ripples through the group, and they provide answers to you, but they also provide answers to each other. So it becomes a forum, which of course is the variation. It allows them to discuss, and of course all the time that you're recording their views and their agreement, disagreement, whatever it might be, and they will take the discussion in whichever way that they wish. So a focus group is a really effective way of gathering together a set of opinions of these people who share some sort of experience which is relevant to your research, in a way, if you can organize it, which is, I think, is a very efficient and effective way of gathering data. Focus group, and again, it's the same sort of thing. It's examining in depth a range of open-ended questions, but the questions are not ruled out, and provide a rich source of qualitative data. So you can see this, there is this the crossover, and the researcher becomes, to some extent, a facilitator who poses the questions and seeing what comes out of it. I would suggest, if you're going to run a focus group, don't do it for the first time without some sort of assistance or training, and indeed shadow someone who's done it before, because if you're an effective facilitator, it really makes your life a lot easier, because it can be a bit daunting. The size of the focus group, normally 8 to 10 people. Because obviously that depends upon availability, and of course anybody who's ever tried to arrange any meetings will know that it can be difficult to coordinate diaries. Having a room that is big enough for when you get 10 people in the room plus a facilitator, and you might have there's the whole issue about seating and whatever else, and also will people travel to it. Quite clearly, with as we've known with the pandemic, you can bring people together a lot easier through the virtual forums. That's one of the benefits of the pandemic, dare I say. But of course, the problem is you lose the immediacy, because you don't see people on screen in the same way as you see them in the same room, and you can observe body language and the like. But okay, the point is though, you did this in the way that you think suits your purposes and will comply with theirs. Obviously, it's got to be smaller for people to share insights, and that's why I think if you get beyond 10, it becomes difficult, and you get people what's known as lurking. So some people will sit at the back and not engage. Although my experience is that once the thing gets running, it develops its own momentum, and people will happily share opinions. A single focus group is risky, because of course if you get a bit cold groups, those who are reluctant. So if you run a few of these over a period of time, they can be very effective. And of course, it almost becomes longitudinal. So you get people opening up; they become more willing to share their opinions. And of course, the other thing, as I said in this final point here, if you run multiple focus groups, you can start to detect patterns, and you can see trends. So and the idea there is about 3 should be adequate to do that. Composition of the focus group, again, it's the same as the interviews. You invite the people you think have got useful views. They've got to be willing to do this and willing to share their opinions. Avoid getting people who know one another, although sometimes this happens in an organization, and that becomes impossible because they're bound to know one another. But the more people are interacting with people that they don't normally interact, the better, because of course it provides this useful interaction. Focus groups don't have to achieve consensus, so you may get a debate, you may get a lot of argument. That can be really useful for getting that spectrum opinion. The other thing is that focus groups are often used to sort of try and develop solutions to a particular problem. So it may be that after all the sort of debating, the facilitator has to try and sort of bring it together in terms of some consensus. But again, that's a different objective. I would suggest that for research, you're not there to try and force them to agree on things. It's just to sort of to record their views. Okay, and again, the participants, they provide responses to the questions asked by the facilitator. So again, it's very logical. So a predetermined sequence set of questions, though you may be flexible about this. Questions should be understood by the participants. Open-ended questions, which allow you to sort of probe and open up the discussion. Obviously, the more you can do this, the better. Record, if at all possible, through an audio device, video even better, whiteboards, pre-prepared sheets, anything that you've got, that can all provide some useful sort of data, which you can then sort of utilize when you come to sort of write up. And obviously, of course, the sort of the important thing is that because this is probably a longer process, I would suggest half day is minimum. Start in the morning, at lunchtime, or start off lunchtime, and in the afternoon. It can go for a whole day, but getting sort of a hold of the people for that period of time, it's got to be pretty special, because people don't want that much time to dedicate. And of course, the other thing is that when you've got a group of people, you have to provide refreshments and comfort breaks and so on. So think about the sort of the logistics and the way you do that. And certainly, I've done this a couple of times where you use a sort of hotel where these things are obviously, you have to pay for them, but because they're all laid on, and it's a very good way of doing it. But the universities are often sort of a good place to do that also. Success in focus groups, think about a process agenda. This is just simply about sort of the way in which you think it's going to work. And obviously, the more you know about the people that you're involved with, the better, because then you can kind of work the room, as it were, to sort of use that cynical expression. But the more you can get people to open up and discuss, the better. It's always about sort of data. So as long as you're getting data, whatever works is whatever works. Using themes to know the questions to generate the data is also sort of a very important point of this. I've talked about the sort of the skill of the facilitator and the sort of the right environment. All of these things come together, and when it works well, it works really well. I do sort of stress that, and it will give you sort of a lot of sort of data, which of course, if you sort of are sensitive to, you can open up new avenues of discussion and get a lot of really sort of valuable sort of understanding and rich data, which will sort of help you to sort of develop this intimate knowledge that's going to sort of drive your research outputs. Excuse me. Again, just to emphasize, think about the questions, the way they can orchestrate, i.e. so they can bring out the right notes, as it were, the right sort of levels of discussion, and sort of the willingness of the sort of participants to sort of to want to contribute. So quite clearly that this is also about your rapport with the sort of the group and their rapport with one another. But obviously, it requires the skill of the sort of person to do that. So, and of course, what you'll find is the more you do this, the better. And skilled facilitators, they do this on a regular basis and develop that skill as a consequence. Okay, I put this in, and perhaps I should have actually sort of done it earlier on, but this is a really good way to think about it. If you're doing either interview, but more particularly focus group, so it can serve both purposes. The opening questions, the easy to understand by all the people involved. So this, if you like, this is opens the doors and gets people going. The introductory questions, which build upon the first one, I encourage the participants to reflect and go deeper through active conversation interaction. The transition questions, to focus on the critical aspects of research that you're interested in, and provide the things that you're really that you believe will be absolutely sort of fundamental to research you're carrying out, and more particularly provide us a logical link to sort of the introductory questions and the key questions which follow. And the transition questions lead into sort of the absolutely sort of critical questions, as it were. And there's 2 to 5 here, but it could be more if you wish. Although again, you're in danger of salami slicing. That purposely developed to provide data that will enable the analysis to be achieved. So this is where you're thinking about the sort of the next stage on, in terms of, I wouldn't necessarily sort of talk about codification, although that's the sort of the way in which you sort of group the themes. But yeah, if you've given some sort of pre-thought, this will be really useful. And then of course, this will be like any process, the way that you can sort of draw it to a conclusion and get people to sort of provide their overview of what they've described and perhaps if it's necessary, some sort of consensus, but obviously it allows you to sort of to end usefully. Okay, right, I've been talking for just under an hour, I think, or, well, I suppose we started just an hour ago. Okay, so just to sort of to re-emphasize the conclusion. So the purpose of interviews and focus groups is depth of understanding, richness, qualitative data primarily, but quantitative data is not impossible, but I would have said that that's more sort of readily sort of and usefully provided through questionnaires. Active engagement with participants is what will sort of ensure success. So the more you can engender this, the better. And that requires skill and you know, the ability to sort of to understand rapport. Yeah, it's about having conversations. If you're good at conversations, you'll be good at interviewing. Research needs to be carefully pre-planned. The process on capital letters and underlined, but be agile. Remember, you're in a dynamic situation. If somebody wants to tell you something different, and yeah, don't rule it out. Obviously, if they want to talk about something which is completely unrelated, then yeah, okay, it may have no relevance, but obviously don't stop them and be rude. But quite often they want to tell you something because, of course, and it will lead into sort of things which you may never have thought about, which I've talked about before. So it can provide you with a new, rich seam of data about things that will drive the research, perhaps in a different direction, which is something you hadn't sort of previously thought about. Recording data is absolutely sort of essential, if at all possible, unless people do not want to be recorded. And you know, then you have to work out another way of trying to record what they say. Observe your experiences, because you can actually sort of add this as sort of another dimension to sort of what you do. As I sort of indicated, but of course, writing up this is perhaps another topic. Requires selectivity and interpretation. This is a skill of the sort of researcher, and this will be something that you'll be examined on and probed upon by the examiners and sort of reviewers of your publications. And do remember, you know, this follows on from the sort of the point about sort of new scenes. Theory building, new explanation is a sign of effective research, because of course that's the whole point, to go out into new terrain and get people to sort of tell you different experiences. Okay, right, I'm going to sort of to call a halt there, so I'm going to stop sharing if that's okay. And oh no, in fact, I'm going to let if Jack comes in, because Jack, you can take over the presentation, because you can talk through the last. Okay.
And then we'll go on to question and answers.
I'm just going to get myself a glass of water.
Did you want to go to the next slide for me? No, he's not going to. He's sorry, hang on. Next slide. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. What we actually have is a couple of clubs which may be of use to people. We have a research planning. So it's getting ready for the data collection. That's a club of exploring a different range of questions and really consolidating data collected and then guiding on firming up your research plan. So that's within the DoctorateHub. You can link into the website to have a look at that at any time. And there's another club that we've pulled together as well, and that's the Research Execution Club. And that's working with the data you collection, and then again, considering any issues you face, and then your checks and balances as you draw up and get caught up in that data. So those two clubs are available if you're interested. They're obviously free of charge. And there's also, if you could select the next page, please, Steve.
Sure, okay.
There's also a number of advanced courses if you are interested. One, for example, is the write-up and structuring your thesis. And these come in three formats: the free peer type support self-study. And then if you feel that you need tutor support, that's a fee for service, or a flexible on-demand feedback again. So they are all available on the DoctorateHub website if you want to have a look at those. And it also gives you all the previous webinars, including the recording and slide decks at any time. We actually have one question, Professor Steve, sorry.
Okay.
I've got, good evening, Professor. If I knew my participants well, should I acknowledge them in my research?
That's a good question, actually. And there's nothing to say that you can't use people that you know. Indeed, yeah. Well, yes. I think that the answer I would give is that if there are personal relationships, and again, I'm trying to tread carefully here. So, for instance, if the answer is yes, because of course, what if I were an examiner and I spotted this, should we say, I would sort of, I want to, well, you know, how did you make the contact? And if it became apparent, well, did you only talk to people that you agreed with, perhaps? It's a really difficult one, because that there's no reason why you shouldn't use the sort of the people that you know. And again, should I, if I knew my participants, yeah, go on.
Quite often they'd be a gatekeeper, wouldn't they?
Sorry, just repeat that.
So quite often they'd be a gatekeeper to give you that opportunity to have access to different organisations.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and the point is about this is that are they only telling it you because you're your friend? But we do this all the time. We use connections. The most important thing is that what they're telling you, what they believe about the sort of things that you're interested in for the research. So that's perfectly fine. So there's no reason why you shouldn't do that. But, and you know, if you then did acknowledge it, I'm just trying to think about an example. So for instance, if I was carrying out a piece of research in my own organization, then yeah, I might know these people, and you know, I would be explicit about that. I mean, the most important thing is that the more you describe what you've done and how you've done it, the better. And if this is an effective way to get that opinion, and it you know, and the data is relevant, then why not do it that way? I see no particular problem.
So it'd be quite, when you've got insider researcher, that'd be a key area where you would actually know the participants. What I might actually do is switch off the recording, and we can go into open questions and answers.
Shall I